watching at a later time on Zoom, and now we are getting set up to YouTube. So welcome to everybody who is joining us on YouTube. We took a break last week for the Thanksgiving festivals, and now we're back studying together as we have a schedule that's gone out. If you haven't seen it, let us know to make sure you're on the list. I'm going to make a little slight edit to the schedule today because I had us studying two philosophers, and I just realized there was just not enough time to do both. So we're using the book, The Many Faces of God, as a basis. But the reason we're only doing one, and the philosopher or sage or whatever you want to call it, we're studying is a man named Richard N. Levy. And the reason we're going to take the full time is because this is a little bit of a different study session for me because I actually knew him. And he was the director of the Rabbinic school for 3 years in LA when I was there. So it was, I know firsthand what type of person he was. Excuse me, I'm going to put a little cough drop on him. He was the nicest person you could ever meet. No idea how much of an impact he had on the Reform movement, even then, because he was just such a sweet man and so nice. He was when you get ordained, you have a rabbi who stands by you as your guiding rabbi, and he was one I chose. Fortunately for me, I didn't keep up with him in later years. I passed away about 2 years ago. I was going to give him, I actually talked to him and found out he had passed away. So that's unfortunate, but he was a wonderful man, terrific human being. And we're going to talk a little bit about his theology, which is a little different also than the others because his is singular to the Reform movement. So what we're going to discuss is the impact he had on the modern Reform movement and what he said and what he did to have this kind of impact. So we'll have to go a little bit back into history to talk a little bit about what came before, but a little about him. He was an assistant rabbi for a couple of years in LA at Beck, and he was assistant rabbi for a couple of years. And so he wasn't a congregational rabbi very long. He went into Hillel. He was the director of a Hillel for a while, and then the director of all the Hillels in the LA area for maybe 20 years or so. And wrote basically the Haggadah they use, and he was very influential. So this is the first of the sages or philosophers we've talked about who really whole career was not academic or in a congregation, but was actually in Hillel working with college students. And then eventually in 99-ish, he was asked to be the rabbi at the rabbinical school where I went. So the head of the rabbinic school. And he did that for years. And then after that, he went into different positions in the rabbinical school. But just the nicest man. His wife was an opera singer. I met her a few times, very nice lady. But he was this fairly short guy, had the beard without the mustache, always jolly. And I remember when he brought me into his office and said, Robert, I want to start a singles group for people in our school, for the rabbis in our, did I tell you guys this one? He said, and I'd like you to be in charge of the singles group. I said, Richard, that's a great idea. In fact, you know what? I'm going to have our first meeting right now. And every one of us is here. Because I was the only single rabbinical student. So I started the club. I was the president and only member for my 3 years there. So just the nicest guy. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this nice man, who if you met him, you would have no idea the impact. He went through Hillel. He wasn't even national director of Hillel. He was Hillel for LA. But yet, because of his writings and because of a 2-year stint as the president of the CCAR, the president of the Reform Rabbis movement, he had an impact that in many ways has set the direction of the Reform movement to this day. And most people don't realize that he was also a very controversial figure which is ironic because he was just such a nice man, a great teacher, and a really great scholar. So what exactly led him to be this iconic rabble-rouser leader? So we have to go back to the early Reform movement in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, the Reform movement was struggling with the direction it was going to go. Ended up going more the way of a guy named David Einhorn, which was, let's use the prophets as guides. We'll be a prophetic religion, meaning a religion of doing good deeds, leaving a lot of the tradition behind. We'll study the Bible as if it's from the documentary hypothesis, where there's different people who wrote, and the Bible is then edited together, the Torah. We'll talk about the individual choice that Reform Jews have, and that's how Reform Judaism will be, that we have our own choice in it. And so through the years, this became classical Reform Judaism as we know it. Obviously, our synagogue is still part classical Reform, part what they call maybe mainline Reform today. So that meant for the people who came into synagogue, no taluses, no yarmulkes, no Hebrew, using an organ because Christian churches were using it, not reading the Torah as if it was, maybe inspired by God, but really written by human beings who wanted to make the world a better place and edited later on. It was about giving us the choice to make decisions. That meant synagogues didn't keep kashrut. If you wanted to keep kosher, you could do it at home, but they often didn't even want you to keep kosher. We don't keep kosher because those rules don't have an impact on us anymore. We don't wear a yarmulke or tallis. Even though it was individual choice, a lot of synagogues would not let you wear a yarmulke or a tallis. Some would kick you out. Some would say, go to the other synagogue. Some might have only one prayer in Hebrew, maybe the Shema. Others would have no Hebrew at all. No bar bat mitzvah. We create confirmation as a way to bring everybody together. So a lot of wonderful things in classical Reform Judaism, and it really centered on behavior. And this became Reform Judaism for a long time. And as we go in hills and valleys, and then things started to change. And more of a traditional outlook became more and more popular in Reform Judaism. And so we started to see a change. I'm sure you guys have seen it in your synagogues. Reform rabbis, Reform Jews wearing a yarmulke, not only in synagogue, but all the time. I grew up in a Reform synagogue, but it was the only synagogue in the area. It was a little bit more traditional, so everybody wore a yarmulke to synagogue. It was just, but only some people wore taluses. So this search for tradition came back, and there was this new debate within Reform Judaism that became really a controversial discussion that at its zenith centered on this Rabbi Richard Levy. Now, why did it center on him? Because when he was president of the CCR, he wanted us to become a little bit more traditional in our outlook. We'll detail that exactly what it meant. But it was one photograph, and funny enough, I could not find it no matter where I looked online. He was on the cover of Reform Judaism magazine, which doesn't exist anymore. I looked everywhere for the photo. I could not find it. He was on the cover. Why was his cover photo such a big deal? Because he was the president of the CCR. He's on the cover of Reform Judaism magazine, the magazine of the Reform movement. He's wearing a yarmulke, a tallis, and he's kissing the tallis. And that became a huge deal with people arguing on both sides how you're not supposed to do this. And that was kind of like the moment where his brand was kind of set on Reform Judaism, and we've become more what we would call traditional. But outwardly, obviously, if you come to our synagogue or Reform synagogues, you'll see a lot of people wear yarmulkes, not everybody. You'll see some taluses. Generally speaking, the rabbis or service leaders are wearing a tallis. And so synagogues have some sort of kosher rules. We don't allow pork or shellfish. That's the main rule here. So he was kind of the focal point when this all came to a head in 1999. It wasn't just the photo that changed everything, though. He guided the CCR into creating a set of principles called the article, A Statement of Principles for Reform Judaism. Twice before, in the 1880s and the 1930s, we had principles, but this is the first time since. And so these principles changed in many ways or defined the course of the Reform movement to this day. And so we'll look at it. Yes, Larry.
Just a couple of questions. Was he inspired to do this because he thought that Judaism was truly moving in the wrong direction, the Reform movement, or was there, Reform Judaism is sort of a populist movement, I think you even mentioned. Was there a kind of an outcry from the people to move back toward traditionalism? Or I guess I'm trying to get at what was his motivation? What was his inspiration for moving?
And we're going to talk about that. That'll be the thrust of the discussion.
Okay.
Overtly, what you saw was yarmulke, keeping kosher, talis, but his reasons were not popular in nature. They were because of his view of our relationship with God. And he thought that we were missing something, and that he was much more a scholar, textual based, and basically getting back to the text, getting back to our relationship with God, doing things with this God concept in mind. And that was probably the reason that he thought we were missing something. So the yarmulke, the talis, the kosher, keeping kosher, celebrating the Sabbath, these were just examples of a larger view he had. They're just the most visible ones. If he hadn't been on the cover of Reform Judaism in that guise, who knows if he would have been so controversial. But he created this platform for Reform Judaism, which was, I believe, unanimously agreed upon, which is almost impossible to believe because we're Jews. And I must have read that wrong. I read something where there's just no way. That's not even facetious. I mean, 1 and 1 plus 1 is 2. We're not going to be all unanimous on that. So, but he was a very popular figure in the back circles because he was just so nice and genuine. And everybody knew he was bringing these ideas to the plate because he thought we were missing something and he wanted us to be better. And nobody who ever met him ever thought he had any hinted agenda at all. So let's talk a little bit about him and what his thoughts are. And in the book, it's on pages, beginning on pages 200. And talk a little bit about his overall theology and then a little bit about what he thought the Reform movement was missing. Now, first of all, his theological views have to do with the idea of connection. He famously uses the analogy of a puzzle, that basically we're part of a puzzle. We may not see all the pieces, but we're part of a puzzle. It's almost like mystical. And he actually realized after he wrote a book using this analogy that a friend of his had used the same analogy 25 years earlier. So he actually had to make a note saying, I did not try and copy him intentionally. So that must have been pretty funny or difficult when he found that out. So he believed that we are all connected. It's almost mystical in its nature, but remember, we're coming from a Reform perspective, which may not have always had this. And that he believed we don't see these connections. So this is very much in line with what we would call, when we studied before, the Kabbalah, that there's these mysterious connections. I like to use the waves in the ocean. He uses the puzzle. And the idea is that in order to see the entire puzzle, we have to be able to connect ourselves to those who came before us. The text, the thought, the people. And that we have to really understand that the good and the bad are all connected, which are things we understand, but remember, he's doing it from a reform perspective. And so we're all connected, us to Moses, to others. And one of the centers of this connection, of course, is the Torah and the studying of it and the connection we have to God through it. And that he thought was something the reform movement was not concentrating enough on, and that was the connection with God. Highlighting the need to do good deeds, certainly, but not this idea that everything we do needs to be connected to God. So when we are volunteering at Habitat for Humanity, it's not just the joy we have out of doing something good, it's the connection we find with God while we are doing it. And he felt like the reform movement was not centering or even sometimes even discussing this idea of the godliness of these connections. And so he was not as concerned about the tallis and the yarmulke as the missing pieces to Reform Judaism that he felt we had left behind. And he also believed that we needed to spend more time working on it, that sometimes we were afraid to go in deep to the text, that afraid to discuss God, to put God in our lives, to bring God to the congregation as rabbis, because that was not why they were there. And he also thought that we were at times grifting, or not grifting is not the word, taking out parts of the tradition that we did not like, but not understanding that everything was part of the tradition. In the Bible, there's a lot of things we don't like. There are wars, there are people treating others. The prophets are always insulting the people because they're not behaving. And he believed all of these things helped create Judaism, and we were not discussing them. A perfect example is the Hanukkah story. Talk about how Judah Maccabee and all the Maccabees kicked out the Assyrian Greeks. That's great. But we talk about it more from the perspective of it was them doing it as opposed to God helping them. We ignore the fact that Judah Maccabee and the later generations became very corrupt. And the Purim story, we neglect the part at the end of the Purim story. We think Haman dying is the end of the Purim story. It's not. The end of the Purim story is the Jews need more days to kill their enemies. So they asked the king to give them one more day to be free to kill their enemies. That's the story. So that we were ignoring some of these things. We were ignoring the idea that our intuition, that our feelings and connections may come from God. So he's almost as, and he's not going against science because he's very, very devoted to science as well, but he thinks that we were lacking in something that was essential for Judaism. So, Michael.
Oh, finish your sentence.
No, that's finished.
You know, reading this, I wrote a bunch of questions, which, you know, may strike people as, you know, not on point. But so
really, we always stay on point here.
Well, but you know, the first thing I was thinking about was, you know, if you're studying, and that's a big thing to him, is how do you study Torah without understanding Talmud? And likewise, how can you study Talmud without understanding Torah? And you know, and he's talking at times about teaching children through our direct experience. And I just don't know, you know, one thing, how you balance that conundrum out. And you know, and that led me to another question, which is really not on point. this might be, but the curriculum in rabbinic school, because if you're studying Torah and you're studying Talmud, and I know it's different in a Reform seminary than it would be in an Orthodox, but how does that come together?
Yeah, and I think these are the exact. Now, he didn't always have answers for these, obviously, but he did have questions as to what we were doing. Are we ignoring certain aspects of Judaism because we don't like it? And he believed that all of the parts we had to study using the Talmud. And, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but he wanted us to understand that for the first 3,000 years of Judaism, we believe that God wrote the Torah, the Bible, the very least, some might say was inspired by human beings, but we believe that all of it came from God. And so all the later writings that come after the Torah and the Bible are written by God, or at least the Torah, depending. But the writers who came later wrote everything else, the Talmud, the Midrash, which he talks about a lot, based on this belief that the Bible was written by God. And so if we ignore that, then we are not seeing where they were coming from. Pretty much all Judaism, there was Spinoza, obviously, but Spinoza, he talks about him, wasn't as far away from that as the 20th century scholars were, who talked about the Bible being written by different people, the Torah being written at different times and edited. So he wanted us to really look at God and see that people believed God was writing it, and that's what inspired them, and not to leave that out. He felt that that Reformed Judaism wasn't always giving people individual freedoms, but saying we gave people individual freedoms, but then saying you have to look at the Bible from the documentary hypothesis. You can't say God wrote the Torah, even though the idea behind Reformed Judaism was you have the freedom to choose. It was a dichotomy or an irony, Larry.
Yeah, this may be very simplistic, but it seemed to me that Reformed Judaism was kind of a reaction to Orthodoxy, where they felt that Orthodoxy had only or mostly tradition, and that they were missing the whole business of communication with God, and we don't need the yarmulke, and we don't need the prayer shawl, talit, and we don't need many of these traditions in order to communicate with God. So they kind of moved away from it, saying that even kashrut was not important, and some of the other things to connect to God, which I thought was a very, ambitious kind of way of thinking of God. I like that way of thinking of him, even though I like some traditions because they evoke memories and things like this. It doesn't sound like, once tradition becomes overwhelming, becomes the most important thing. But what he seems to be saying is we've got to, even though you're saying that the yarmulke and the talit are not that important to him, he seems to be, he was photographed with it. That's what caused the controversy.
I mean, they're important to him, but that was not the basis for his belief system, right? We need to wear a yarmulke and talis.
But he is basically going back to the idea of, that you really have to have these traditions in order to communicate with God. This connectedness that he's talking about then is more of a connectedness with God. I'm just reminded of a sermon I heard many, many years ago from a rabbi in our New Jersey congregation where he talked about connectedness, but kind of in a little different way, where he showed, he said, here's a series of, in those days, we didn't have charcoal grills. We had charcoal grills, not the propane grills. So you had a whole series of, little briquettes, and the briquettes were lit. And then all of a sudden he says, let me take one of those briquettes away from the remainder of all the briquettes that are lit. What happens to that briquette? It goes out very quickly. And he used that as an analogy, a metaphor to show, connectedness to the community, connectedness to the Jewish community, rather than connectedness, of which part of it was connectedness to God. So it did seem to me that you could still connect to the community and, still not have these traditions. I just wondered why he tried to evoke, such a criticism by that picture that you say, which was probably instrumental in causing this big rift.
I don't know if it was a big rift because we ended up all coming together. It wasn't like the Reform Judaism got divided or people left. I don't know if he knew it was going to be that controversial. I can't imagine he knew it was going to be in the moment. I mean, maybe he did, but he had, he's working on these on this platform for the Reform movement, and he has, if not universal support of the leaders, a lot of support. So for the leaders of the movement, it may not have been controversial, but for the people out there who weren't in, it was. So I'm not sure if he knew ahead of time it was going to be so. He literally came to my school right after that came out. Like, we're hearing all this controversy. I walk into the office, and then that guy is the dean of the rabbinical school. So it was, and he was, again, I don't know if he meant to do it, but that's a good question. I wish I'd talked to him more about this. At the time I was so wrapped up in my own world, I didn't ask him that often about the bigger questions that he had been answering for so long. That's a good question.
Was there a reaction from the Reform congregations that many of them said, no, we don't want to go in that direction?
Yeah, there definitely was.
Many of them split away from the...
No, they didn't. No, I don't think any congregation left Reform Judaism, thank goodness. But basically, a lot of people were saying, this is not the Reform Judaism I want. I want to have my own Reform Judaism, be Reform Jew. So there are synagogues who went different ways, but I don't think anybody left the Reform movement because of it. But I could be wrong. So that's a good question, though. He was more concerned with, if you had to summarize his belief, it would be something like, don't forget God. He is much more God-centric than Reform Judaism had become. Kind of like Kaplan in many ways, but basically saying we believe in God even if you don't think you do. It's a Kaplanian that I believe in nature and the consistency. Well, he would say, well, you believe in God. And find God and bring God into your life. And don't be afraid to talk about God. Don't be afraid to bring up difficult issues and to grapple with the positive and negatives. Don't forget to have faith. Flossie.
Was Humanistic Judaism at this time?
Oh, yeah. Humanistic Judaism was very popular and still is. In Reform Judaism, it was very popular. It's probably a little less so now, but very much so. Yeah. So he is almost...
Well, then he was the other end of the...
He would be on the other end, but he was... So, yeah, he would definitely... But he also believed people had choice to find their connections, but he did believe there was a God and that we are all connected and we should... But if you said you didn't believe in God, he wouldn't say you're not a Jew, you're not a Reformed Jew. He would just say, let's see if do you really not believe in God, or do you believe in a God that you don't understand can be considered God? But yeah, he was definitely not a humanistic Jew.
Right.
Oh, no,
Right. No, but what you said, I think you caught the core of it, Rabbi, when you said that he wanted to return, also remind us that there is a God, but he wanted to return choice to the Reform movement. Like you said, the Reform movement went one way where they would not let you wear a kippah or a talit. I remember when we first came into the Reform movement many years ago, the congregation was more one way. And then I could slowly see it change as the rabbi had an influence over the congregation, and it changed more the other way. So the choice was there again.
Yeah. And it's accordion, hills and valleys, but you're right. He didn't want to dictate what we needed to believe. You said it better than I did. Obviously, he wanted to ensure that the choice was actually there. And I think that's a better way of saying it. Flossie.
When did Humanistic Judaism come in? Did people question, quote?
I would say the basis, again, all of these things come in the 19th century. A lot of it has to do with the freedoms coming into Europe. A lot of it has to do with Jews moving to America and coming to grips with these opportunities and freedoms that they were not used to. So that's where a lot of the basis of all of this comes from. Being a humanistic Jew in the 17th century was not something you wanted to outwardly be, because you would be an outcast from the community in many respects. Now, there were Jews who were not religious, but there were not that many Jews who were going around saying, I believe in the Bible, but the Bible wasn't written by God. We know one famous one, Spinoza. He was actually believed in God, but he was routinely kicked out of the community for his belief system. If he had waited to the 18th century, he would have gotten away with it. He would not have been popular, but he would have gotten away with it. In the 19th century, he would have been lionized. So he was basically 1 or 2 centuries ahead of the game. Larry.
Could you briefly give us a couple of highlights of some of the 13 principles?
How about this? I have them right here for us to look at.
Okay.
And these are not 13 principles. That was the original was 13 principles. This is the, it's adopted in Pittsburgh. Some people call it the Pittsburgh Platform of 1999. They kind of did some editing a little bit a few years later. But we're going to see in this, and it's not that long, but let's look at the sections they divided into. God, Torah, Israel, and that's it. So they divided into 3 sections, and one of them is God. One of them is Torah, and one of them is Israel. They're not dividing it according to ethics or mitzvot. So let's go over and see what they say through this. I remember my favorite story about the Pittsburgh Platform, I'm sure I tell this all the time, was when my senior rabbi at my last synagogue wanted to find this book. And he had me looking it was a giant synagogue, looking at all the libraries, at the other rabbis' libraries all around. And after an hour, I couldn't find this book. And I said, well, Roy, what are you looking for? He says, I want to find the Pittsburgh Platform of the 1880s. And so I went on the computer in 3 seconds, I had it for him after I'd looked around for an hour for the book. So it was pretty funny. So on 3 occasions during the last century and a half, the Reformed Rabbinate has adopted a comprehensive statement to help us guide. I forgot the 1976. So 1885, 1937, and then kind of a set of guidelines in 1976, not looked at as much so. And then we say statement of principle affirms the central tenets of Judaism are God, Torah, and Israel. I would say also the people. Those are the 3 they picked. So let's look at God, which is also the first one. We affirm the reality and oneness of God, even as we can't always understand God. That's the first thing they say. There's a God. We are bound to God. Everyone is created in God's image. We are expected to revere God and recognize our responsibility to this world. That gets us more into the ethics, but we're looking at ethics through the vein of God, as opposed to the opposite. We encounter God in moments of awe and wonder, and in acts of justice and compassion. So he's combining, Buber with Heschel here, combining the idea of different. So this really incredible what he's doing. Heschel was not a Reformed rabbi, remember. He was we respond to God daily through public and private prayer, through study and performance. How many Reformed synagogues have daily prayer? Very few. But it is there. We strive for a faith that fortifies us, that helps us in times of need. We continue to have faith in spite of the terrible things in the world. Although God created us as finite beings, the spirit within us is eternal. This is a very different set of things than the 1885 one, which I can look up and show you in a little bit. Flossie, it's beautiful.
Rabbi, what does it mean when it says We were created in God's image.
That is a good question. It does not go into specifics about it, but they want that there for us to remember it, believing that that is something the Reform movement has sometimes not always thought about.
Rabbi, I don't see anything really radical there. I mean,
Not radical today. It wasn't radical to the people who were signing on to it. But the fact that the first thing was God, the fact that you talk about God, that we believe in God, that we're connected to God, that everything we do is in accordance with God's vision, that it's not controversial in 1999 because we'd already been moving towards that way. But this kind of solidified it. So I don't look at it as controversial, but some people would.
1998.
And again, this was not that controversial as much as the picture of him on the magazine for whatever reason. In fact, the picture on the magazine is known as the tefillin picture. And you're supposed to ask, was he wearing tefillin? No, he wasn't actually wearing tefillin. That's just what it became known as, I think.
Yeah, that first section reads almost to me like a prayer from something from a prayer book they could have copied, and
Yeah.
With reverence to God. Once you believe in God, if you say, I believe in God, everything else falls in place.
Yeah, and it's a spiritualness. Now, he thought we were missing it. Not everybody's missing it, but he thought this was something, and we'll talk a little bit about how that came into practical view. We affirm the Torah as the foundation of Jewish life. That obviously is not controversial at any age. We cherish the truth, that it's a manifestation of God's love. We affirm the importance of studying Hebrew. That's the most controversial statement in this that people who were not part of the rabbinic leadership looked at, because obviously Hebrew was not a center tenet. You didn't even have to know any Hebrew to get into rabbinical school. I got into rabbinical school I applied in 1995. I think I applied in 1995 1995. So I was the first class that had to pass a Hebrew exam.
Oh,
Not only that, so we the first year of rabbinical schools in Israel. So you were assigned by your Hebrew level, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. So after the first day, most of the people in the Hey class, the highest class, had to be moved to the Aleph class, the lowest class. Why? Because if you did the test they gave you, to the Hebrew test, if you didn't do well, guess what they did? They gave you the exact same test to do again. So what that meant is, I don't know Hebrew very well, but I know exactly the questions. So I just have to look up the answer to the questions. So all the people who didn't know Hebrew very well, this is how ridiculous it was. They ended up in Hay because they had taken the test twice. And so they all knew the answers, even though their Hebrew wasn't good. Now, remember, the Hebrew test my year did not matter to get in. Like when I took my Hebrew test, you didn't have to pass it to get in. They just wanted you to see it was like a year or two later when it became a requirement. Or maybe they did. Maybe you did have to pass it. I can't remember now. I passed it, by the way.
Now, what was it about? What was in the test? Was it speaking or just reading comprehension? Or
It was reading comprehension. It was a lot of modern Hebrew, and then there was a biblical Hebrew section as well. I did not know any. I studied in Israel, so I did not know any biblical Hebrew. So I just left that section blank because that was an extra section you could choose to. But I was not familiar with it because I'm studying modern Hebrew, so I took the modern Hebrew test. So
what is the difference between modern and biblical Hebrew?
Well, modern Hebrew is much more, I would say advanced in terms of there's more words, there's more grammar. Biblical has a lot of key words that lead you to something. Plus, if you're studying modern Hebrew, you may not get all the words in the Bible because there's some very particular words in the Torah and the Bible. And so, but if you're fluent in modern Hebrew, you can read biblical Hebrew and understand it all. You may not get the grammar exactly right.
Did
But
biblical have the little vowels underneath?
they only added that about 1,000 years ago.
Oh, okay. And why
So-
did they add it?
Make it easier so kids can learn.
No, yeah, it made it easier for kids and adults to learn. They felt like 1,000 years ago we were losing Hebrew. And so a group of Jew sages got together and created it. So if you live in Israel and you're brought up in Israel and you speak Hebrew and you're fluent in it, they don't have vowels in their books. Like the only time you'll see vowels in modern Hebrew is for little kids, like kindergarten and first grade. After that, you'll never see it again.
Thank you.
We are committed to the ongoing study of the whole array of mitzvot. So in other words, we're still committed to what we said in 1885. We bring Torah into the world when we seek to sanctify the times and places of our lives through regular. So we're bringing the sanctity of God and Torah into our houses of worship. We bring Torah into the world when we strive to fulfill the highest ethical mandates. That is, again, pretty close to 1885. Now, here's the Israel section. We are Israel, a people aspiring to holiness. So again, they're using Israel in two contexts when I would separate them. There's the people of Israel and the modern state of Israel. We are committed to being a religious and cultural religion and use that as an expression of the vitality of Jewish communal life in Israel and the diaspora. Complete equality for women. We are an inclusive community opening doors to Jewish life to all people of ages. That obviously is a new thing. We must
Including the
actively
intermarried.
encourage people to come if they want to convert. That's a new thing too.
Was intermarried the first time that this was
No,
Discuss-
intermarriage was not a big part of Judaism all originally.
yes, including the intermarried? I mean, they made a special converted, including the intermarried. I mean, it looks like they went out of their way to make sure that that was parenthetically put in there.
Yeah, remember this is 1999. The Reform movement decided to allow intermarriage in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So
Oh,
this was not controversial by this time at all.
okay.
Women, people go through conversion, people are gay. That would already been started. Now it's kind of assumed it's not a big deal. This put the stamp of saying this is what we want. It was already starting to be part of it as we are.
Could you go back for a moment to the one on Torah where it says about let me see if I can find, if you could go just scroll up for a drop.
Okay, oh, sorry.
The one on Torah where it says about the commandments, the mitzvot, because I thought I read something quickly where it says that demand renewed. It says sacred obligations have long observed. Others both demand renewed attention as a result of this unique context of our own time. Because they're talking about the whole array of mitzvot, the entire 613.
Exactly. Not only that, yeah, exactly.
I thought that they would have said something that, where they, as a result of the unique context of our time, does that kind of open the door to the fact that, we don't have to obey all 613? Is that controversial? Well,
It is. Remember, all 613 don't have to be obeyed by anybody because a high percentage of them are with the temple, with the so we don't need to do those. But yeah, I mean, what they're bringing to play is, let's not forget all the other commandments that Jews have followed for a long time. So our modern sensibilities do not require us to ignore them.
Well,
Now, it also validates our support of the state of Israel and talks about us as the community of Israel. So these are both. So It doesn't read controversial to us in 2021 at all, because this has all been part of Reform Judaism for 30 or 40 years. At the time, it was a little bit controversial, especially with the Hebrew part. But, Reform Judaism always professed a willingness to let people choose, even though that wasn't always the case. But by the 1990s, it was becoming more and more so than it had been previously. But this was kind of like the stamp that said the rabbinic leadership is in support of all of these things. And this would not have been the case in the 1970s. There would not have been this much support for this platform by any stretch of the imagination just 20 years earlier. It really speaks to what had happened in the world in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and how Reform Judaism was trying to create a modern religion that still kept the tenets of God and text as part of it. So it's a powerful statement, and it's really short. So really well written, obviously, as they did. Any questions?
So the sexual orientation part that you had there, was that the first time that was specifically mentioned in the platform?
Yes,
Was
definitely
it-
in the platform, but it
Yeah.
was not the first time in Reform. Reform Judaism had voted on that. The first gay rabbinical student was in the 1980s. So it was in the school itself. By the time I went to school in 1995, it was not a big deal. It was a big deal, but it was not like, earth shattering, because it had been going on for 10 years. It was assumed it was okay. So it's a combination of, we want to be modern in the way we treat people who are different than us. We want to be welcoming of them into our religion, which is all, but we want to also go back to the idea that God is a part of it, and we should be talking about God and the text and the tradition and the fact that we're all connected. So it's a really powerful statement. And realize they said he was a short guy with almost like a Santa Claus face, with the beard with no mustache, that just made him look almost Amish in some ways. And just the nicest guy. So it was really funny that he became this controversial figure. I can't imagine. I think he wanted it maybe a little bit, but I can't imagine he knew it was going to be that controversial. I think, yes, Flossie, then Larry.
How do the Orthodox accept or reject gays? Is it completely they're not accepted?
Well, there's different levels to Orthodoxy, and there's really two ways to look at this. One, it's a sin. That's spelled out very obviously. It's in the text. You cannot avoid that, because it says it.
Of not reproducing, and that's so important to us.
Well, we're going to get to that second. The first thing is, it's a sin. That differentiates them from Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism. However, you can look at it as a sin that's a crime against humanity. And you can look at it as a sin, whereas people commit sins all the time. I talk negatively about somebody, it's a sin. I look at your car and I want your car, that's actually a sin. So you can say it's a sin and we commit sins, or you can say it's a terrible sin that bans you from our building. So it just depends on who you are and what you allow. So some places it's fine, just, don't tell, don't be overt about it. And in some places you're ostracized and you can never come back. It's just what's your brand of Judaism, I guess, Orthodox Judaism is.
So a lot of it is hidden in the community.
Oh, and the ultra-Orthodox communities, it is very hidden, 100%. You will, if you get caught doing it, a lot of them, that's it. You're not killed or anything, you're just kicked out of the community. So there's been movies and documentaries about it. It sounds crazy, but in all the Jewish world in the 1970s and 60s, it was hidden. For a long time, it's been hidden in every culture. It's what's it say? No tell. How do you say that phrase again?
Don't ask, don't tell.
Don't ask, don't tell.
Don't ask, don't tell. That's the policy, I think. Now, what you can also do textually is you can say it is a sin, but Flossie, what you said, let's say I have 10 kids. I've fulfilled the mitzvah of having children, which is the main reason, obviously, that you're not supposed to have. And so what if I'm gay, but I have 10 kids? I mean, there's a lot of debate that you can make in here. And also, it's not being a homosexual that's against the rule. It's the act of being a homosexual. So saying I'm a homosexual, that's not against the rule. If I have intercourse with another man, that is a sin. So there's a lot of ways to look at this, to look at that debate, depending on who you are.
Okay.
Larry, then Michael, I think.
Yeah, several years ago, Jane and I were in invited to hear it was the new chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He was giving a talk in one of the large synagogues in New Jersey. And I remember a lot of the questions that came to him were that, why are this conservative now, why are our services so long in the morning and the Saturday morning, and they're basically boring? Can't you issue an edict to the rabbis to shorten the service, so we don't repeat it so many times? And he says, look, I make it, each of the individual rabbis of the congregations has their own, let's say, their own mandate from the congregation as to how they want to, plus their own as far as how they want to preach. And I'm just wondering, so he kind of led you to believe that there's a lot of independence, is what I'm basically saying. Now, in the Reform movement, so we issued the 13 principles, even though none of them are too startling, except that, that time. What actually happens? Do the rabbis then, who were voted in by the members of the congregation, say, no, we don't want any, intermarriage in our congregation. We don't want to recognize, people, gay, lesbian people in our congregation, and they want a rabbi for that. There's no compelling, it's no pope, so to speak. There's no compelling, Rabbi Schneerson, who was the edict, who was making the one statement saying, everybody's going to do this.
No, I applied for the job, but I didn't get that. That's a great question that differentiates the Reform movement and the conservative movement. And I give this analogy: the conservative movement is like the Constitution, and the Reform movement is like the Articles of Confederation. The Reform movement is all of these synagogues together with a weak central government. So the central government only has as much power as we want to give it, because there's the URJ does not make rules that all the congregation have to follow, except for maybe the dues to be members. So the Reform movement does not come out and say all Reform synagogues have to have people wearing kippahs, or have to keep kosher, or have to turn their lights, only have non-Jews turn on the lights on Shabbat. We don't have anybody. We have people who write thoughts as to what we think should be done, but there's nobody at the central conference saying you can't do this. I mean, at the URJ. And the same thing with the rabbis, unless you're doing something that is considered, illegal or immoral, like, having an affair, which is not actually illegal, then the Reform rabbis can't tell you to do anything. So we're all a group of congregations coming together with like-minded ideas, but each congregation will set all of its own rules. So if our congregation decides to have a pork festival every year, that's fine. Now, the articles we just read said we want to keep tradition, but that doesn't say we have to do it this way. Our congregation here probably had, I bet the Orthodox congregation had shellfish probably 50, 60 years ago. I'm just kidding, but so we get to make all of our own rules. So As to hiring a rabbi, there's some basic rules. You have to have somebody who's gone to seminary, somebody who's been out a certain amount of years to get your congregation. It's a way to keep the competition down and any cutthroat business. But when I interviewed for this job, the congregation, each congregation I visited had their own views of what they wanted the rabbi to do, which is very fair because they want, when I'm applying here, I want to know what they expect of me and likewise. So when I came here, one, we want you to do intermarriage. Are you okay with that? If I had said no, they probably wouldn't have hired me, which is fine because they let me know. I said, sure, I feel fine doing it. There's some specifics I have about it, but two, we don't want you to fundraise. That was this congregation, not other congregations. We don't want you to do all the managing of the financials, which I don't do at all anymore. I did some of that at the beginning, but not at all anymore. So that was what I said, listen, I wear a yarmulke all the time. Is that okay with you guys? Because they never had a rabbi. I think the interim rabbi, I think, was the first rabbi who'd even worn a yarmulke. And so for me wearing one all the time, I said, listen, I wear one all the time. Is that going to be fun? And they said, no, that's not a problem at all. I wear talis on the bima. Is that a problem? No. Here are some things we may not want you to do when leading services. And I talked to them and said, okay, we compromise, no big deal. But if they had said, you can't wear yarmulke, you can't wear talis, and you have to do intermarriage, and I would not agree with it, then I would not
be a good fit.
And I wouldn't be hired. Or if I was lying or they were lying, then we know what happens later on. It becomes problematic. So in the conservative movement, though, that is not the case. The conservative movement has set rules for what each congregation can do, but there is leniency in some areas. So does a conservative congregation have to be kosher? Yes, that is a rule. There may be different ways you do it according to what you can afford. Maybe a congregation can't afford 2 kitchens. So they're not going to be able to be as strict as a congregation that can't afford 2 kitchens. They're not going to be that strict. Do you have to wear a yarmulke in services? Absolutely. If you are a man, you have to wear one. If you're a woman, you're given the option. Do you have to wear a talis? I don't know specifically, but I think you don't have to. But so that I think is left up. But it's off. Some may. I don't know if that's mandatory or not. Certainly not for boys who are under 13. But I don't know if it's a mandatory for boys. That's a good question. But Sabbath, there are rules you have to follow about keeping the Sabbath. But there are some rules you don't have to. For instance, the most obvious is amplification. That's a big deal. If you have a big conservative congregation and you can't use amplification, that's a problem. So the conservative movement doesn't say you can't have amplification. There are probably some rules as to how you do it, but I'm not sure.
You mean microphones not only for the sermons, but microphones for music, or those
Exactly.
But even microphones just to broadcast to the
Right.
the congregation.
So at one time they probably had a very specific rule about that. I don't think they have it anymore, because now you go to congregations that are conservative and they do use amplification, and some conservative synagogues actually have people playing not only acoustic guitars but electric guitars.
Yeah.
So I don't know all their rules, but I know they have rules to keep. A conservative rabbi cannot do intermarriage, period. It's not an option. Can you go to the intermarriage of your cousin, but you're not performing it? Now I think you can, but I think years ago you couldn't. So they change the rules as they go along. Yes, Jane?
I just wanted to say that in New Jersey, you can go from county to county and the rule changes about intermarriage.
Now it does.
Well, even 20 years ago.
Really? In the conservative movement?
Like if you lived in Morris County, yes, you could not perform an intermarriage. But if you lived in Essex County, you could.
As a conservative rabbi?
Yeah.
Wow, that's because that is that recent? Because they only allowed that a few years ago, so they may have been doing it without letting people know.
Could be.
Yeah, because, and for instance, interfaith couples, you could not be an interfaith couple and be a member of a conservative synagogue. You might be able to have an individual member. I'm a member as the Jew, but my wife is not. They changed that just a few years ago. So I'm sure conservative synagogues, some break the rules, and don't, as long as you don't, there's probably some no ask, no tell stuff going on. For instance, when I was in rabbinical school in the 90s in LA, so I was in rabbinical school from like 98 to 2002 in LA, you could not be homosexual and be ordained as a conservative rabbi. That was an absolute no. However, we all knew who the gay conservative rabbinical students were. I mean, they weren't hiding it outside of the building. They were just hiding it in the building. It was a no ask, no tell. Don't come into the building holding hands with your same-sex boyfriend or girlfriend. That, as long as you didn't do that, you could be ordained. So don't flaunt it, basically. So there are rules and there are rules. So that's the difference. So Flossie and then Larry, and then we'll conclude.
Are we on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Aren't there gay synagogues at this point?
Yes, there are. And now, again, a gay synagogue, do they only allow people who are gay in? That's going to be up to the synagogue, but most of them probably don't. In the Reform movement, you can't have, the Reform movement will not say you can't have gay, you can or can't. I mean, the Reform movement has these are what our belief system. You get to choose if you're going to do what. Do you have a service on Saturday morning? That is not required in Reform synagogues, or Friday night is not required to have services. In the conservative movement, it is, I believe, to have services every Shabbat evening and every Shabbat morning.
Just off your top of your head, because we attended a program yesterday talking about female rabbis and the history and going back. In your graduating class versus, let's say, a class today, how many women candidates were there and those that actually graduated as rabbis?
Well, again, you have to remember there are 3 campuses in the US. So we all go together in Israel our first year, and then we're divided up our next. So we usually go by your Israel year, because when you come back here, some people do an educational year, some people take a year off, some people. So my class in Israel, I believe, was the first ever class to be majority women.
Really?
Wow.
Wow.
That early.
Yeah, and the rabbinic one. I don't think the numbers have gotten any higher than they were in the early 2000s, but I think it's still a majority of women. It's probably, and I am completely guessing, 60% maybe, 55, 60. Overall, if you take a look at over a 25-year period, certainly some years are going to be the other. And it was higher. It's now, oh no, maybe, I bet it was higher in earlier years than mine. But anyway, so, I mean, it stands, think about it. There are actually more women on planet Earth, and women, generally are more studious and more empathetic and more social and better at multitasking. And I'm not just saying that. I mean, I think that's been proven time and again.
Your favorite part of the whole talk.
So once the
Rabbi,
doors
you're on a
opened,
roll. Keep
Yeah.
going. Keep going.
so once the doors opened, it was natural for women. And plus, now, women rabbis at the top level are still not equal to men by any stretch of the imagination. So the largest synagogues still have a majority male senior rabbis, but that'll probably change over time, hopefully. But also, you never know. It could be for different reasons. Women may want to take off to have children. Women may not want those positions because they're more, concerned about family time. There's a lot of debate in this area as to why women haven't got to those levels yet.
Look at Central Synagogue and the position she
Right.
has.
So I don't think I actually don't think most Reform congregations are now caring if it's a man or woman. I think they're all looking for the best possible fit. But I know that's probably not true. I'm sure there's some places where it's still. I know at our congregation, the person who there were two of us who they were looking at. The other one was a woman, and that same woman and I were being looked at in another position in Oklahoma, and she got that one, and I got this one. So we were 1-2 in reverse. Yeah. So I think Savannah has a long way to go overall for female clergy. There are not that many female clergy in this area. There are more now than there were 9 years ago, but there's still a stark contrast between men and women in Savannah. So, and
Thank
Savannah's
you very much. Okay, you surprised me with your answer.
hopefully in a good way. Larry.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the HUC question. Now, I realized there were two, I thought there were the Cincinnati and Los Angeles. You said there's a third.
New York.
And New York. Okay, I forgot about New York. But
It's a place in the Northeast somewhere. I think it's close to Maine, something like that.
okay.
Yeah, I think it's like next to Maine.
Yeah, they got some big buildings there, right?
I have no idea if they have big buildings there. I'm not that knowledgeable.
I've heard.
Okay.
This rumor. But at any rate, do they divide the students up by, in other words, is Los Angeles known more for pulpit rabbis, or Cincinnati known more for educational rabbis, and New York more for
That's a good question.
educational, do they all have a mix, and do they all follow pretty much the same curriculum?
Now let's go back to I'm so proud to be the first of so many things. It used to be when you left Israel and came to America, you got to choose, went to Cincinnati, LA, or New York. However, if you went to LA, you only did your next 2 years there. Then you had to do your last 2 years in Cincinnati or New York. So you weren't ordained. You couldn't be ordained in Los Angeles until 2002. That was my class, was the first to be ordained in 2002. I know they didn't want me to be representative of the first class ever in LA. They tried to convince me to go somewhere else and to not do it, but I did it. That's a joke. And then, but how do they divide you? You give your preference. You're not guaranteed to get it, but you give your preference, and then they divide it up according to what slots they have. If you want to go into education as an extra, you will probably go to LA because they have the education school there. So as a rabbi, if I wanted to get a master's in education, I would go to LA. If you want to do more, kind of study into the history of a modern American Judaism, then you would go to probably Cincinnati because that's where the archives are. If you want to go to have a pulpit, you'll probably go to Cincinnati or New York Cincinnati or LA, because there's not that many in New York because there's so many rabbis out there. You're not going to get a monthly pulpit. So they each generally teach the same things, but they're very different because of the professors and the outlook of the campus, CPE here. But in terms of class number and how you are ordained, yes, it's very similar. But obviously, if you want to save money, you're going to Cincinnati. Anybody who puts Cincinnati number one just probably is getting to Cincinnati, because that's the central campus, and a lot of Jews want to be on the coast. So if you want to go to Cincinnati, you're probably going to be able to go there. A lot of times it has to do with where your family is and where you're from. I'm a New York person. I want to be in New York. My family's on the West Coast. They're trying to get rid of people. What they want to do, which they haven't always been successful at, is you're ordained in LA and you apply for a job in Philadelphia. Are they going to tend to go to somebody who was ordained in New York? Is there going to be some sort of bias, which probably does exist a little bit? I mean, you're more used to the area, you have friends in the area, you're going to stay in the area. If you're from LA and they think you're going to go back to LA, are they going to hire you for free? And so there's all these little things in there, but who knows?
Is this only for educating U.S. rabbis? In other words, if you get smicha or a graduate from U.S. HUC LA or HUC New York, whatever, are you then recognized in Paris or?
Yes, you're recognized everywhere. Israel, of course, is a different animal because the politics and religion are mixed there. That is changing now. But obviously, if you're educated in America and you don't speak Hebrew fluently, you're probably not going to be able to get a job, as a rabbi of a congregation there, unless it's an an English-speaking congregation. But if I'm a rabbi, there's not that many ordaining schools. There's one in England and one in America.
Oh.
So that's pretty much it for the main ones. So if you're a Reform rabbi in Germany, you may not, you're going to have to probably speak German, but you're not going to, so you'll have to have gone to America or England for school. If you're a rabbi in Australia, though, or England, or any place that speaks English as the native tongue, then I applied for a job in Australia. So, no big deal.
But they do not have a school in Germany then that,
They may have one now. I don't think they do. I think they still use the one in England.
What about counseling?
One more time.
What about counseling? How do they all educate on how to talk to people?
Oh, yeah. So the Reform movement does the Talmud and does the teaching, but they do a wide variety of the things, how to give sermons, how to visit people in the hospital, how to do counseling. You can have options of getting extra stuff. Like if you want to be a counselor, you do more things. We go to generally the same track, but there's some people who want to be a congregational rabbi. Some people want to work at camps. Some people want to go to be a professor. Some people want to go into education. So there's a wide range of areas. And generally, though, the studies geared you more towards being a congregational rabbi. That's, at least when I was there, that was still the main thrust. Some people weren't always happy with that, obviously, if you don't want to do that. Flossie?
Where in Israel is the school? Jerusalem?
It's in Jerusalem. It's about really, really close to King David.
Oh, really?
A very, very,
That's a
very expensive piece of property. It's a big property with a view of the old city, although we may not have it anymore because they were building stuff behind it. It's so close to the old city that there were bullet holes from from 1948 to 1967, when Jordan controlled the other side. You still see bullet holes, but the property there is, I can't even imagine. It's 50 million. I don't know. But it's beautiful.
You're not buying it then.
It's a stunningly beautiful campus and one of the best places in the world to be Jewish. So obviously they got it a long time ago before it was such a prime piece of real estate, but it's beautiful.
Rabbi, what is the percentage of students who apply and who actually graduate and get ordained?
That I don't know anymore because I haven't been in the school. Again, if you got to a certain level of the applicant, if you get to the level where you're getting to be interviewed, I think that was a much higher percentage. So getting to the interview process, that was the hardest parts. You got to the interview process, I think it was like 30 or 40% maybe, but to getting into the interview process was a lot smaller percentage. But I have no idea what it is the last 20 years or so. And it probably depends on, it's not the same every year because some years they're going to be a lot of outstanding candidates. Some years are going to be outstanding candidates, but not what they're looking for. I mean, it's kind of sometimes,
With the pandemic, they didn't have a graduating class?
Oh, yeah, they did. Yeah.
They did.
How many people in a class?
I don't know anymore, but in my class in Israel, there was about 50 of us, maybe.
Okay.
I'm trying hard to remember, because remember, the first year in Israel, the rabbis, cantors, and educators are all together.
Yeah.
So, and some years are going to be more, some years, LA is the smallest campus by far.
Wow.
So some years they're only ordaining 25 rabbis for the whole country. And some years they're probably doing 40 or 50.
How many congregations are there, Reform congregations?
I think it's about 950, maybe,
Wow.
in the US and Canada. But, some range from 50 people to, 3,500 families. So
Not all of them probably belong also to HUC.
all of those 950 do belong to the URJ.
Oh, okay.
That's counting only ones that are members of the URJ.
Okay.
There's probably others that consider themselves Reformed that are not, don't paying dues. There, you have to pay dues to be a member, and they can be expensive. But at all the synagogues I've found, when you're having some financial issues, the URJ is pretty good about, saying, listen, let's talk it over and figure it out. Flossing.
Compared to Jews who belong to a synagogue versus unaffiliated, is the unaffiliated still very high?
Oh yeah, it's always it's higher, much higher. Now, the affiliation rates are generally very, very much along the size of the city. So the smaller the Jewish city, the smaller the number of Jews in a community, the higher the affiliation rates.
You're going to say to have, yeah.
Yeah, the larger the city, like New York, the smaller the affiliation rate, because they obviously have so many options to be Jewish. It's not such a big deal. We're in Savannah, we have a very high affiliation rate compared to a big city like Atlanta.
I could attest to that because I grew up in a small town in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and people belong to have, a community, a connection.
Right.
So.
Oh, and by the way, Larry, I think that place you talked about, Pennsylvania, is close to the city you were talking about.
Yeah, we've heard of it. Yeah. Ben
Okay,
Franklin
good.
Something. Ben Franklin lived there.
Yeah, it all comes to, I don't know, Ben.
I'll check on it.
Yeah, I'm from a small town. Most of the Jews in the community were members of the synagogue, and everything in the Jewish community went through the synagogue because it was the only Jewish entity at the time. So that's how I grew up. But it's been awesome. We went way over today, but I'm trying to remember what we're doing. I just forgot what we're doing next week, because the week after is Hanukkah.
Judith Paskin next week then?
What'd you say one more time?
Did you want to do Judith Paskin next week?
We can. What we were supposed to do, and she again alone is probably, you're talking one of the premier, what is feminist liturgist in our religion. So it's not, we were supposed to do Salani Torah next week. I'm happy to do Judith Pascal if you guys want to do that instead. Again, we have a lot. I basically didn't do everything on Richard Levy. There was a lot more. We did like the first short part of it, but if you guys want, I'll switch it to do her next week, and then we have the Hanukkah party. If we still go through with it on the 15th, it's actually a post Hanukkah party.
Okay, so who is it? I'm sorry, Rabbi. Who is it next week? I just wanted to.
Her name is Judith Plaskow. She may be the very next one in here.
She's the last one in the book.
Is she the last one? She's the last one. And
you're going to tape as usual because we're going to be away.
Yeah, it'll all be recorded and stay on. And she is one of the two or three major feminist theologians from the Jewish world from this time period. Like the ones who kind of started her, Moshe Falk, and Racha Adler are probably the three most famous ones. And Racha Adler was actually a professor at my rabbinical school. So it's one of the great things about going to the rabbinical school is you meet these people that are, writing all these books and creating all these things. You can always say, I knew that person, right? I studied with that person. That's kind of cool. All right, guys, a real pleasure. Have a wonderful rest of Hanukkah. And hopefully we'll see you at the Hanukkah party Friday. If not, we'll see you next Wednesday as we talk about Judith Pascal.
Okay.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Yeah.